Howdy, and welcome to Farmers Fight. On this week's episode, we will finally begin to discuss some historical events, which presumably is what you're all here for. However, we will not be talking about the populist or anything directly related to them, as we are still in the foundational phases of this series. Instead, we will use this episode to crack the nut that is Reconstruction. This will be the first in a string of episodes taking place within the Reconstruction Era, which I am defining as existing between 1863 to 1877. If you have spent any time reading about the American Civil War or the Reconstruction Era, then you know that these two periods are so dense and well-researched that they could literally be podcast series unto themselves, which somebody should do if they haven't done it already. But because I want to keep these episodes fairly brief, and the show is literally about the historical populist and their fellow travelers, I have taken some editorial liberties and attempted to hone in on the major events, ideas, and issues that set the stage for the populist revolt within the Reconstruction Era. Reconstruction is the soil from which the weed of agrarian malcontent sprung. So while this and future episodes will touch on some important events within Reconstruction, they are meant to be contextual scaffolds for us to build on. In between these contextual pillars will be shows covering specific topics happening simultaneously to Southern Reconstruction. The four-pillar episodes will cover what is typically called wartime or Lincoln's Reconstruction, which is today's episode, presidential Reconstruction, which is set between 1865 to 66, congressional or radical Reconstruction, which took place between 66 to 69, and finally, the end of Reconstruction, better known as Redemption, which will take us all the way to 1877. Got it? Cool? Okay. So let's get started with our introduction to wartime Reconstruction, here on Farmers Fight. Episode 3, An Introduction to Reconstruction. A few years ago, I realized I have a minor but serious affliction, something I have come to call historian's disease. This undiagnosed mental disorder is best characterized as a sense that one cannot fully understand a subject without learning everything there is to know about it. I personally dislike glossing over stuff, especially when it comes to history, as you have a tendency to miss out on the complete picture. So as much as it pains me not to talk about every single event that brought about the Civil War, I think it is worth surmising how we got to 1861. You are all probably familiar with at least one cause of the Civil War, racialized chattel slavery. But the peculiar institution served as a proxy for other social, political, and economic conflicts taking shape throughout the 19th century. It is not at all incorrect to say that the institution of slavery was a central cause of the Civil War, but it is more complex than just an argument over the moral fitness of the system. The conflict was expressed in a multitude of ways, leaving scholars to posit different interpretations as to the war's causes. Was it a moral crisis? Was it social or political? Was it purely a battle of ideologies, or even a consequence of Christian theological interpretations? Or was the issue one of labor and regional economic interests? Of course, all of these factors I just mentioned are interconnected and not easily separated. But in my eyes, the Civil War was largely a fight over the changing economic and political dynamics between the industrializing North and the old agrarian South, as well as a battle over the future of the Union's economic system. If we take the view that slavery was ultimately a question of labor and economics for Southern planters, that doesn't negate that it was a question of constitutional law, as well as theologically and morally abhorrent for many Americans. Moreover, the expansion of slavery and the fight over admittance of new territories helped to inflame the growing sectional conflict between North and South. To explain the war's causes, I want to focus on the period between 1780 to 1860. Historians have defined the two eras within this time frame as the Jacksonian Era, and my favorite, the Era of Good Feelings, which both generally fall into the period best known as the Antebellum Era in the South. Most historians agree that the era of good feelings existed between 1815 to around 1825-ish, and was characterized by the collapse of the Federalist Party, victory in the War of 1812, and an attempt to eliminate partisan politics from national life. These factors resulted in a general optimistic view of the country and its direction, hence the name Era of Good Feelings. Anthropologist and mathematician Peter Turchin says that the era of good feelings was one of great social cohesion and a reduction of political instability and polarization. But the positive climate of the 1820s didn't last very long, as socio-political tensions again flared after the 1828 election of Andrew Jackson. The Jacksonian era, which lasted to about 1854, was characterized by a general democratic or populist fervor, exemplified by the enfranchisement of all white men regardless of status or property ownership. The era was also characterized by open attacks on political elites and the moneyed aristocracy, increased democratic participation, increased territorial expansion, and a general collective or communitarian view of the country. As a consequence of these two eras, the young nation's territorial holdings grew threefold between 1780 to 1860. At the same time, its population grew tenfold due to high fertility and low mortality, but it was also helped by massive immigration from Northwest and Central Europe. Even though roughly 80% of the population lived in rural areas in 1860, most people were confined to the old eastern seaboard, where population growth forced a segment of the society to migrate either to cities or out of the region entirely. Many of these settlers traveled to new territories located west of the frontier, which brought them into direct conflict with native peoples. But this is another factor that Turchin attributes to the increased social cohesion of the era, as formerly rival European ethnic and religious groups created a shared identity out of these experiences on the frontier. Similarly, the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast and opened up massive tracts of land in the plantation belt that were purchased at very cheap prices. A second factor was technological advancement and regional economic diversification. Although much of the early American economy was based on agriculture, it was clear early in the nation's history that several distinct regional economies existed. This was mostly a product of the sheer size and distance of the new nation, but became evident during the struggle over ratification of the Constitution and later over the issue of slavery. Though cash crops like tobacco, sugar, and rice had long been a factor in American agriculture, the invention, or rather improvement, of fiber refining machines like the cotton gin revolutionized the cotton industry in the United States and consequently drove the economic model of antebellum slavery. As the plantation system grew in the southern states, its manufacturing base remained generally small, as well as accumulation of liquid capital amongst its laborers. The general aversion to banking from Jacksonian Democrats and a penchant for rural rather than urban lifeways led the South to become a one-trick pony economically speaking. The domination of plantation slavery resulted in the South becoming dependent on exports to sell their goods and reliant on imports of commodities from the diversified agricultural economies in the West and the emerging industrial base in the Northeast. Though most poor landless whites and small farmers did not own slaves, many were dependent on the market economy controlled by the planter class, and were beneficiaries of the existing racial caste system. Still, whites who supported the Free Soil Party in the late 1840s viewed slavery as a threat to white laborers, as it depressed economic conditions and concentrated capital, as well as social and political power, in the hands of a small elite class. In fact, much of the battle over the expansion of slavery was couched in a defense of free white laborers against the potential erosion of their rights by the slave-owning class. In 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out that had Northern industry secured a monopoly over the South's raw materials, and if wage laborers nationwide had not been threatened by the expansion of slavery, then it is likely the North would not have touched the system of slavery at all. Du Bois goes on to say that the war occurred because Southern planters wanted free whites to compete with slave labor and to monopolize and expand its power. Equally important was the refusal of industry to lose its material base in the South. For white laborers, the war was a fight for their very humanity, as the economic and political interests of Southern and industrial elites threatened their traditional lifeways. Ironically, though, those same whites were unwilling, or just unable, to recognize the common humanity of the enslaved. For Du Bois, the nation's oligarchs, those masters of industry and finance, joined the side of abolition and full suffrage for blacks out of self-interest, namely, to undermine the Southern elite. These tensions led to some of the many pre-war conflicts you may have learned about in school. They include, but are not limited to, the 1820 Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and the like. As pro-slavery and abolitionist factions engaged in increasingly violent physical conflicts, such as the Bleeding Kansas Border Wars and John Brown's assault on Harper's Ferry, national tensions grew to a fever pitch, and the social cohesion of previous eras was at an all-time low. Everything came to a head with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, after which you get the secession of South Carolina and the eventual attack on Fort Sumter. After that, it was, as the kids say, on like Donkey Kong. So with that brief background of how we got to the Civil War, let's fast forward to January 1st, 1863, and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Upon its passage, the Emancipation Proclamation invoked notions of an era of unbounded progress to come. This sort of optimism was expressed through the most common language of the era, evangelical Christian revivalism. Christian interpretations of emancipation saw the effort as the ultimate cleansing of the nation's great sin of slavery. But hope for a brighter future did not last long, as the majority of freemen were quickly cajoled into a state nearly indistinguishable from their pre-war status. As we will see, emancipation brought with it a cascade of social effects that were both multi-pronged and long-lasting. In one proclamation, Lincoln and the Union simultaneously freed approximately 4 million people who had endured nearly 2.5 centuries of chattel slavery, liquidated the largest concentration of private property in the nation, and thrust the South's labor system into utter chaos. If the Civil War had originally begun to preserve the Union, in the years between 1863 and 1877, it became an expansive and transformative event in Southern life, one that would sweep away existing power structures and attempt to redefine the role of blacks in the broader society. By the war's end, two major questions lay central to the post-war South and America as a whole. What was to be done with the freedmen, and how should the country's banking system be reorganized to bring a measure of economic fairness to the plain people, white as well as black? Early in the war effort, the question of enslaved peoples in occupied and loyal states was part of the federal debate. Radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens endorsed the emancipation of slaves as a way to weaken the Confederate economy. Legislation to this effect was passed that year with regard to fugitive slaves. The federal government eventually agreed to compensate slave owners who voluntarily freed their slaves, all in a bid to undermine the Confederacy. In June of 1862, the Congress prohibited slavery in current and future territories. In July, it passed the Confiscation Act pertaining to the slaves of convicted Confederates. That same month, Lincoln drafted what would become Presidential Proclamation 95, the official name for the Emancipation Proclamation, but he did not issue it until after the Union Army's victory at Antietam. A preliminary proclamation summarizing the intent and timing of the pending Emancipation Proclamation was issued in September. Though technically freed by the issuance in January 1863, the nation's black population found themselves in a precarious situation, since the proclamation only freed slaves in states still in rebellion. It did not, in fact, make slavery illegal, as Lincoln saw it as a war tactic designed to weaken the rebels on their home turf. Lincoln and his administration were focused on a peaceful reunification of the states and did not have an immediate strategy to handle the masses of freed slaves now wandering the South or flocking to Union lines. Within a year of issuing the Proclamation, however, Lincoln tentatively proposed a program of Southern Reconstruction called a Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, later known as the 10% Plan. The goal of this plan was to establish loyal state governments that would undermine Confederate political appeals to Southern whites. The 10% nomer refers to a stipulation that once 10% of the state's voting population had taken an oath of allegiance to the Union, the state could establish a new government and re-enter the Union. The only stipulation was that a state's new constitution be ratified and expressly abolish slavery. No stipulation was made with regards to the rights and protections for blacks, as those details were left up to the states. In his 10% plan, Lincoln extended the offer of a full pardon for rebels and a restoration of full rights, barring slavery, with the exclusion of high-ranking Confederate leaders. Some contemporaries thought Lincoln was far too lenient on Confederate defectors and far too soft in his approach to black civil rights. But as we will see, Lincoln, the Republicans, and the nation were far from unified with regard to the fate of the freedmen. At the Maryland Constitutional Convention in 1863, many delegates denied that support for ending slavery implied any sympathy with black equality. Concerns over the voting powers of an enfranchised black population created internal conflicts that engulfed many states, including the border states in the upcountry who had far less slaves than those in the Deep South. Still, the end of slavery in these areas was looked upon by small farmers, manufacturers, and laboring whites as favorable due to what a slave owner observed as, quote, great satisfaction among laboring whites to see that the non-laboring slave owners would be reduced to working in the fields without their slaves. Louisiana was the only state in the Deep South to experience true wartime Reconstruction. When Union troops captured New Orleans in April 1862 due to its strategic location, it was both the largest city in the South and a Union stronghold. It also had the largest population of free-born blacks in the Deep South. The unique history, education, social standing, and above all wealth of this population was unparalleled by any other community of free people of color in the country. Seeing themselves as closer to whites than enslaved blacks, they believed that by abandoning the larger struggle for black equality, they could gain their own political rights faster. While Lincoln appears to have endorsed the idea of limited inclusion of some mixed race and free blacks in a letter to Louisiana Governor Michael Hand, the fragile political climate of the state would not abide by such a radical notion as black suffrage to become law. As in other states, Unionists were divided between radicals who sought full and equal rights for blacks and moderates who carried a mix of opinions as to what should be the role of blacks in society. Louisiana's radicals were shocked when pro-abolitionist moderates demanded the expulsion of all blacks from the state during the Constitutional Convention. Such a notion that free black people should not live among whites was common as far back as the early 1800s, when Henry Clay attempted to set up Liberia in Africa. Even Lincoln sought to resettle freed slaves in different countries in the Caribbean and South America in 1863, but he stopped the program when hundreds died of smallpox in Haiti. In 1864, future Tennessee Governor William Brownlow urged Congress to create a separate and independent territory as a, quote, nation of freedmen. Such a suggestion and outright opposition to anything approaching black suffrage persisted well into the post-war years. To further compound the racial dimension of Reconstruction, a sizable cultural and class division lay at the heart of white Southern society. Future President Andrew Johnson embodied Southern resentment towards the rich plantation owners, whom Johnson believed, quote, had drugged poor whites unwillingly into a rebellion. Johnson, himself a Southern Unionist, Democrat, and slave owner, was motivated to end slavery in his home state of Tennessee, not for the sake of the black community, but out of hatred for the Confederacy and its elite. Historian Eric Foner quotes Johnson as saying, quote, "Damn the Negroes, I am fighting those treacherous aristocrats, their masters." Johnson had a long history of opposing anti-slavery legislation, and even asked Lincoln to exempt Tennessee from the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. In Johnson, we get the embodiment of the racial attitudes of the day, combined with the seething class division between Southern elites and the majority of Southern society. A contemporary of Andrew Jackson, Johnson grew up in poverty, was born to illiterate parents, and did not attend formal schooling. At age 10, he was bound as a tailor's apprentice, but left for Tennessee by the time he was 17. Johnson was indeed shaped by his hard-scrabble origins, but learned to use them to his political advantage. As a politician, Johnson was an old-style Jacksonian who was popular amongst Tennessee's small farmers and tradesmen. He harbored prejudices towards enslaved and free blacks, and was openly hostile towards the planter elite. Still, when Lincoln installed him as the wartime governor of Tennessee in 1862, his demeanor towards freedmen began to change. Whether due to a true change of heart or a product of shrewd political ambition to serve on the presidential ticket in 1864, Johnson agreed that the peculiar institution must go. He released his own slaves in August 1863, though he still lobbied for a stay on emancipation for Tennessee at large. By 1864, the black community in Nashville mobilized to support Johnson's administration. He began to speak of elevating Tennesseans of both races, and told a black gathering that, quote, "I will indeed be your Moses," elaborating that he would lead them to liberty and peace. When chosen as Lincoln's running mate in 1864, Johnson's nomination by the National Union Party, which was pretty much the Republican Party with a different name, was to be seen as a reward to Southern Unionists. For Republicans, Johnson was sufficiently radical. His fiery criticism of the Confederate elite, with his accusations of treason and advocacy of hanging those traitors, coupled with the fact that he was the only senator from a secessionist state to remain in his seat, led Republicans to see this Southern Democrat as an ally. When Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, the task of post-war reunification with the South fell on Johnson. Like Lincoln before him, however, Johnson engaged in a blend of contemporary racism and anti-slavery humanitarianism, of which he had only recently converted. In their personal lives, both men shared many similarities. Both were raised in poverty and became self-made successes, Lincoln as a corporate lawyer and Johnson as a tailor-turned-landowner. Still, if the experience of poverty and struggle had produced a witty and politically flexible figure in Lincoln, it had the opposite effect on Johnson. Johnson was indeed a courageous politician and accomplished speaker in the eyes of the public, but privately he was a lonely and self-absorbed man. He was stubborn, intolerant of different views, and unable to compromise, which were not really the best traits for a president in the midst of a civil war. It is perhaps these personality differences that led Johnson and Lincoln to approach government and Reconstruction in disparate ways. Before the war, Lincoln was a Whig who supported economic growth through direct government support. Such views stood in contrast to the old Jacksonian Democrat Party of the South, who was wary of government growth and centralization. By the time Johnson became president, the Republican Party had tempered its overt racial prejudices towards blacks, as had Honest Abe before them. Though Lincoln was openly against mass enfranchisement as a condition of Reconstruction, his position softened shortly before his death. Had he survived, it is likely that he and the Republicans would have sought a different outcome for the freedmen as opposed to the lenient terms Johnson imposed on former Confederates. His approach would ultimately leave the freedmen in conditions not dramatically different from that of slavery. Unlike his predecessor, Johnson's view of the freedmen remained little changed beyond his acceptance of emancipation. For him, the war was more about punishing what he termed the slaveocracy, or the planter elites who controlled Southern society. He was far less concerned with the condition of the freedmen and what their station would be in a post-war American society. In fiery speeches, Johnson proclaimed, quote, treason must be made odious and traitors must be punished and impoverished. Although Johnson was not openly sympathetic, his relationship to the black community was nuanced, albeit grounded in a sense of paternalism based on his role as a slave owner. Johnson was known to speak of his own slaves as his masters rather than theirs. Even Johnson's daughter Martha said that Andrew belonged to his slave Sam, not the other way around. By 1867, Sam had been appointed a commissioner in the Tennessee Freedmen's Bureau and asked Andrew to donate a plot of his land to the construction of a schoolhouse, which Johnson willingly granted. After Emancipation, celebrations in Tennessee were the largest in Johnson's town of Greenville, where Johnson frequently addressed the crowd of freedmen. Still, his private views of black rights and black people were pretty standard for the era, i.e., most were incapable of managing their own affairs. As we will see in forthcoming episodes, the Johnson administration saw a speedy reunification of the North and South as paramount to the nation's health. But his desire to be lenient on the South as a whole, likely out of sympathies towards low-class and middling whites, undercut his ultimate goal of punishing the Confederate leadership. Dubois summed the situation up best when he said, "Now President Johnson, the great hater of the aristocracy, knowingly or not, used the poor whites of the South to advance the interest of the planter class and to deliver the nation into their hands." Next episode, we will stay within the same general time frame, but shift our attention towards sharecropping and free labor ideology. We will not pick up our discussion of Andrew Johnson and presidential Reconstruction for a few episodes, but if you want to learn more about the Civil War and read some of the specifics I omitted, you can check out some of the source material I used for this episode by going to farmersfightpodcast.com. You can look at the show notes for this episode, as well as the bibliography page. You can also go to the Support the Show link and make a one-time donation or become a sustaining contributor. There's also an email link where you can tell me what you think about the show so far. I already had a few friends tell me to slow down, which I tried to do this episode, so it's always appreciated, and please keep the constructive criticism coming. Lastly, if anybody has any musical chops, I would be happy to play your cover of The Farmer is the Man. The introduction and outro music you're hearing right now is my hasty rendition of that old American folk song that's been done by people like Pete Seeger. So even if it's you just singing in your shower or some like weird electronic dance cover, okay, well maybe not that one, but either way, it'd be cool just to have some kind of community participation. So that's it. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Farmers Fight.